I remember when my daughter was young, 1 year old, sitting in the high chair with a cup of juice in her hand with a nice lid on it, and it would fall all the time. And of course, me wanting to be the helpful father would run quickly as I could to pick up that cup and put it in her hand so that she would be okay. And then I remember her getting to the phase where she was a toddler and she was walking around the house with another little juicy cup with a lid on it that was made specially to not spill. And she would drop it on the ground, and then I would start to say things like, pick it up. And then she would pick it up. And then it continued to progress as time went on. Then, you get to some point with your kids where your kid has a cup without a lid. You're starting to feel really brave in your household. And your kid spills their drink on the floor, and right away, your first inclination is, I'm going to go and I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to solve this problem for my kid. But then you realize really quickly that if I do that every time, then my kid's never going to really learn how to clean up after themselves. So you do it the first time. You show them how it's done. You talk them through it. You explain where to get the towels from, what to do with it, how to clean it up. And then the next time it happens, you say something like, Daddy, I spilled. And you say, not my problem. You take care of it. And then you finally progress to the point where you're actually brave enough to give your kid the actual glass cups. And you give those to your kids, and then they have to go through the whole same process again as they drop them on the floor and shatter them across the floor. And you have to figure out how to train them how to sweep up the glass without cutting themselves, place it in the trash can, be safe about it, so that the next time you could say the same thing. Not my problem. You figure it out. There is something to be said about the raising and rearing of children, that we have to think of our role and responsibility to see them progressively increase in certain areas to the point where they are handling things on their own. That's kind of the goal if you really think about it, that in even the smallest things we do, like teaching them how to drink and clean up after themselves with a cup, we want them in every area of their life to get to the point where they can go off on their own, be independent, individual people who can take care of themselves, responsible enough to deal with their own problems and deal with them rightly. And yet, we need to think about, how do you accomplish that in your child? There's lots of things that you can do, and one of those things is by letting your child deal with their own failures, their own missteps, their own problems. And that is what I want to talk about, and that's what this is all about, is talking about what do we need to say to our kids? What's a phrase that we need to think through in our parenting to add in? Is maybe not so drastic and sharp as this, but hey, kid, teenager, whatever it is you've got going on, I'm not just always going to come to your rescue. I'm not always going to solve every problem, because that's not my problem now. I'm transferring for your good and for your sake this problem onto you so that you can learn and grow from it. Now, I say this as something that I need to caveat a few things before I jump into some of the nuance of this. Here's a caveat that I'd like to give you. This is not the most important thing you could do in your parenting. There is a lot of tools in your toolbox as a parent, and your teaching, correction, discipline, your instruction, you even sending them to good church, to a good youth group, to listen to the word. There's so many things that are essential in your toolbox. But when we think about all those things, say you can go through the list and you say, for years I have attempted to discipline my kid in this way, and to teach them in this way, and to come alongside of them and coach them and show them, and to grow their levels of responsibility and show them how they should live. All of that's good, but if you don't get to the final phase of shop class where you actually let them go build something on their own, are they ever really going to get it? And so we cannot neglect something that is somewhat essential for our own kids to be able to get to that point that we want. And we see it in culture, like we talked a little bit about last week in terms of the hard work. We see a culture of young people struggling to have ownership and responsibility. And I think one of the contributing factors that underlies all this is that we have a generation of parents whose tendency and propensity in their style of parenting is to solve all the problems for their kids. That propensity for a lot of parents is to come alongside, swoop in, and make it so that the child doesn't fail like they failed. Oh, I understand the pain and the hardship of failure, and so I don't want you to fail. And now we have a culture of parenting, at least generally speaking, where parents have really one of two things. Either they do absolutely nothing, or they're involved in everything and controlling everything to the extent that they don't want their kids to undergo any real challenges. So we're perpetuating a sense of you will take care of it for me. You will deal with my problem. Someone will come to my rescue. Instead of seeing our children grow up and be a generation who is capable of doing their God-given responsibility of being someone who can stand firm on their own before God and do what he calls them to do and own and bear up under their own weight of their responsibility. Now, let me give you a little visual illustration that I just want to point out why I think this is a little bit of the case at this point. At this point, why is it that we struggle with this? Okay, so here's my visual illustration for you. All of you in this room, myself included, we all have a personal awareness of our own individual failures, of our missteps, of our sins, of our errors, and we all are aware of that so intuitively, and it's in every category of life. So we've got things like our relational status. I mean, I've made failures when I was younger and I was dating and I did this, or in my marriage, I know that this happened and I have these problems. I see them, they're there. We see it with our own finances. I wish I would have done this when I was younger or done this. I wish I would have done school this way and not this way. I mean, it just goes on to every aspect of our life, even culminating in our spiritual lives. I wish I would have read the DBR every year, but I didn't until I was this age. And we are so fully aware, personally, of our own failures. And what happens to us is because we are aware of them, and sometimes the greater those failures are, the bigger the swing is. But what happens is we have a pendulum that swings over, and the result of this is that we have this internal sense of like, that's bad. I don't like that. I'm afraid of having those same failures. That's what we do. So I'm afraid of going through those same missteps, having the same blunders along my course. I don't want to do that. I'm afraid. Or we look at our lives and we have a sense of regret. Man, if I could just go back, I wish I could, but I can't. And how do I deal with this? I wish I would have done things differently, but I can't. Or we even get to the sense where we have a sense of guilt, where we say, man, I feel bad about my missteps, my failures, my errors. Now, the problem is, as parents, we get to a certain phase in life where we've learned most of the lessons that we can learn to apply to our lives. And so what we tend to do is, instead of having this swing as a pendulum in our own lives, we look at the next generation, we look at our kids, and we start to say, well, I know what this is like, so I'm going to help you figure all this out. So the pendulum swings as far as it can over to the other side, and now our goal is to have our kids have an avoidance of personal failures in their life. We're saying, I want my kids to not have the same problems that I had because of my missteps in their life. Right? Now let me say, again, another caveat here. That's actually kind of smart, if you think about it. That's biblical wisdom. That is the idea of learning from the previous generation by seeing those who are wiser and learning from them. But the application of how we do this is important. Because if we just say, okay, my goal as a parent is to have my kid avoid the same errors that I did, that's a good goal, but how do you go about accomplishing that? If the means by which you go about accomplishing that is by coming alongside of them, teaching them, explaining to them, walking in the path with them, as the scripture would say, as they go about it, explaining your life, your story, what happened to you, showing them biblical examples, descriptions, pointing them out on other people's, those are all good things. But if your method of accomplishing this looks somewhat similar to the other things on this list, and it's based out of fear, that you're afraid for your children, that if they do anything like what you did, it's going to be bad for them. So then we respond not in a coaching, directing, or allowing them to do any sort of failure, but we tend to protection. We say, our job as a parent is to not allow any failure. I'm going to come in and swoop in when the daughter's cup is falling and grab it before it hits the ground. I'm going to put a bubble around my children so that they don't have opportunity to fail. I'm going to keep such close tabs on them that there's no wiggle room for failure. If it starts to go in that direction, we've really swung the pendulum and say, because of all this stuff, now I don't want my kids to go through it. I'm going to avoid it for them, and I'm going to be the agent of protection and ultimately the agent of control in their life. Now, I feel like there's already a lot of caveats, and I have to caveat again. In some sense, in every aspect and phase in parenting, there is a component of complete and total control. You don't just hand the keys to your children, right? You take them out into an empty parking lot and you show them how to drive. Then you put your foot on the other side of the car while they get in the seat, and you're engaging some level of control. But as you go on in the parenting realities, these moments that we have as parents, you have to relinquish some of that control and some of that protection in order to give them the opportunity to either succeed or to fail. Otherwise, they cannot learn, they cannot grow, they cannot gain independence, and they cannot become responsible and act on their own accord for God in what He's calling them to do. And so we have to think about this final little niched part of the toolbox that says, now once they figure out all the tools and they've gone through the classes and you've done all the safety briefings, now you actually just have to let them take that skill saw and go into the garage and build something. They have to have the opportunity, without your control and without your fear and without your protection, to have the opportunity to succeed or to fail. And that is the progression that we want. Control that slowly relinquishes as our kids get older. And what often happens in parenting of teenagers is that we go through these crisis moments where we lock down control, but then we get afraid. We get afraid of them repeating similar actions, and we never open it back up again and give them opportunity. Then our kids get to the end of their time at home, and they've had no opportunity to put into practice these things that they need to learn in life, to learn from the experience of failure and success in their own life. Missteps, misfortune, all kinds of things that we could say. I don't know how you want to say it. Misfortune is not one I would use normally, but error in their own life that has caused them to grow in some way or another. So, this is one of the reasons why we do it, but how should we think about this? How should we as a group of Christians say, what do we do with our kids to see them actually have some opportunity for failure, opportunity for success, still maintain some level of control, and do all of this at the same time? So let me take you to our passage that I want to use as our framework for a little bit of this today in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I want you to think about this biblical principle that is being stated here and just think about your child. Okay? 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10. This is Paul speaking to the church in Corinth, and he says, of course, to Paul, this is now him quoting God back to himself, saying, my grace is sufficient for you. God is saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. This is talking about in a person's weakness, in a person's inability to do everything that they want to do. That's when my power, God says, is made perfect. Then Paul says in response to that truth, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness. Of my weakness. Not of his strength, not of his success, not of all the things that he's accomplished, not of his pedigree or of his background or of the many converts he has, but of his weakness. Saying there's a recognition in his own life that his failure to be the person that God requires him to be is the very thing that causes him to boast in Christ. That aspect of his life is essential for him to think and act rightly in the world. He needs to be able to see his weakness, his failure, his error, his sin, even the idea of God. Why did God allow Paul to persecute the church like he did, to kill and stand at the martyrdom of Stephen? Why was that allowed? It seems like in some sense, God is allowing this to be a constant reminder of his failure, so that he would have a constant reminder of God's grace and his sufficiency and his power. And so he's always in his mind, this is important for you to think this way. He goes on and he says, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness. And I just start here and just say to you, if we were to just replace these words just quickly here and saying, is your child bad at school? Are they weak in some way? Emotionally, physically, is there something wrong with them, right? Is there something that's not quite the standard that you would set? And then I'd say, is there a level of contentment here that you have? I mean, I'm all for the level of expectations. There should be some expectations. You should desire your kid to do well in school. You should desire them to be socially engaging. I want all of these things. We should drive towards this desire. But at some point, we have to sit back and say, the things that they're not good at and the things that they fail in, specifically if they try and then they stumble and fall and fail, if you can use that as a lesson, those are the tools that God often uses for them to grow. How many of us can look at even our lives and say, I'm content that I'm not that great at this, that I don't have this aspect. I can't get up there and do what this person does. This coworker can do this better. Are you content with your failings, with your inadequacies to some degree? Are you okay with that? And now when we look at our children, can we say the same thing? I'm content. My kids are content. Or have you built up in your life an expectation of them that they have to reach perfection? They have got to satisfy all of your desires for them. You don't want them to have the same errors or flaws. You want them to be successful, and you want them to do well and have great relationships. And because of all of this, your bar is so high that there is nothing that will make you content as a parent if they fail in those regards. I'd say that's not good. That's not wise of us, because everybody is different and we all will fall and stumble and err and sin. And so what do we do knowing that that's the reality of our lives? We can't have the expectation of perfection, so we have to have a different expectation that we will fall, that we will fail, and that our children will. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is I would say it this way. I would say, point number one, you need to let your teens walk through failure. The first thing I would say is you cannot be the parent that creates such a hedge of protection around your kid that you do not allow them to fail. I'm not saying that you should want your kid to fail. I'm not saying you should encourage your kid to fail. I'm not saying that failure is good. I'm saying that you should at least have a mind that says they can. Because if you set the expectation so high that they can't, then we're going to have problems. You're going to have problems in your parenting. There's something about normalizing the experience of failure within your own home that is helpful for our kids to make the progress you want them to make. The goal you really should have is progress, not perfection. And so to let your kids learn through their missteps in whatever area of life that is helpful in their own education of learning how to live this life in a Christ-like and godly manner. They're going to have to figure some of this out as they wrestle and reflect on their reality and what God's word has to say about it. You need to let them walk through this with you in some level of failure. Even the idea of this is present in some sense that the people that have a recognition of their own weakness are capable of their own failure, of their own shortcomings, are able to see ever more presently the reality of who God is and what he offers. Just like in that previous passage, we have it here. Right? We know this passage well, but at the end it says, there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart, they fail. I'm not capable of giving you what you deserve. I'm just not sufficient. I don't have it. There's a sense of real humility and perspective that takes place here, and then it drives the person into recognition and worship and praise and activity for God is what it does. But God is the strength of my heart because I'm not relying on myself. When we expect our kids to be perfect, to meet every expectation that we set, and we don't allow them to fail, and we set up protections all around them, they begin to develop a sort of prideful, boastful arrogance about themselves if they accomplish it, and they become so discouraged if they don't accomplish it that we stall out in both directions. You either become to the point where you say, I can do it all, and it's because of me, and you give no recognition to God, that further growth is stalled, halted, or the kid gets so discouraged by not meeting those expectations because failure is not allowed in their life that they get so down on themselves that they just give up and throw the towel in. We need to think, especially as we're getting our kids closer to adulthood, how do we increase this in their life? How do we allow them to have more opportunity to do things that might allow them to fail? So we need to let our kids walk through failure. Now, as I was writing this and as I was thinking about this, I was talking to my wife about it on the phone, and I was saying, there's some examples of this that I can think of in the Bible, but there's actually one that's bad. There's a bad example of this. It's the example of Eli and his sons. You guys remember that story? You got Eli, he's a priest, he's got these two sons, and the sons are known for not being great sons. And the idea here is that they're skimming the extra fat and getting it the way they want it and not following God's rule of how it should be done in the priestly order in the temple sacrifice. And it becomes known to Eli, and Eli rebukes his sons, or at least he says he rebukes his sons. He is, in this sense, letting them walk in failure, but as the story progresses, you see this does not go well for his sons. His sons now face destruction, right? But there's this interesting line in between the story that talks about his sons and this unnamed prophet that comes up and talks to Eli and says, what the real issue is here is, why do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded you, and honor your sons above me? I mean, there's a heart thing at play with Eli while he's allowing his kids to do what they're going to do and be adults and be priests and make their mistakes. There is a protection of them. He is seeking to keep their position and their honor and maintain it above what God asks them to do. And if we get to the point where we can't let our kids make us look bad, we can't let our kids fail, because then all of a sudden we have a bad reputation and they have a bad reputation, and that might mean further failure. We've got to think, this is not right. If my kid does something wrong, I need to speak to it, but I need to at least give them the opportunity to do it and then speak into it. Now, there's always the chance that they won't come out of it. They won't learn. They won't glean from it in this situation like this. But at the heart of it, what's identified in this passage in 1 Samuel is, well, you have been the cause of this, parent. The reason why Eli's sons went the way they went is because Eli chose to continue to honor them above God, to protect them, to value them, to make sure they were okay. And if we ever start to think that way with our kids, we want the best for them, but you know what? What's best is what God says is best. And what God says is best a lot of the times is when we mess up, we need to deal with it. There needs to be an appropriate response. So I say for point number 2, when your kids fail, you need to direct your kids to respond to failure. Your job as a parent is to have an availability and some position, especially with teenagers, to let your kids have some room for this. But that's not your only responsibility. You cannot just say, not my problem, and leave it there. There is more to be done. You cannot identify the issue and say, hey, you messed up, and then not say anything else. There needs to be a direction from you as a parent when your kids fail. Now, first, they need to have the opportunity to. You need to allow them to walk through it. You can't be an overly protective parent. But once they do, which they will, if you allow them this, your job now kicks in full gear, and you need to take on the responsibility of directing them. I think there are 2 ways that a person goes when they fail, biblically speaking. 2 ways they go when they fail that your kids will go. And the first response that they will have when they fail is they will have pride that leads to destruction. That's what will happen. If your kid fails, it's easy for them to get mad at other people, point the finger, say, that's not my fault, that's someone else, and there is a propensity, a desire within all of our own hearts to defend ourselves when we fail, to put the blame on something else, someone else other than us, and respond in pride. And we know, biblically speaking, that when you respond that way, then comes destruction. And we have tons of examples of this. So let me give you one real quick just for you to think about this. Think about King Saul for a second. King Saul was anointed king. He was told to obey God in all things. And we have this misstep from King Saul when he is about to go fight a battle and he is supposed to wait for the prophet to come so that he can sacrifice in the right way, and he can't wait. And so, because he can't wait in his own heart, he errs. He falls, he falters, he has a failure. And he decides that he, as a king who is not a Levitical priest, is going to go do the sacrifice. And right away, it is told, this is a sin. You have disobeyed the commandments of God. You have done wrong, you have erred, you have failed. And it's amazing because there's like no recognition of this at all in Saul. It's like there's like no statement of like, oh yeah, I'm so sorry. His first response is, well, you weren't here on time. Prophet, you said you're going to be here. It's getting scary around here. We got to go win this battle. We got to do it. The first response is a prideful response that pushes the blame off of themselves for the misdeed that they committed and onto someone else. Think about your kids when they mess up. How common is it for them to just immediately point the finger at you, at their friends, at their teacher, at their schoolwork, at their circumstances, and say, it's not me. It's not me. It can't be me. I can't be in the problem. My misstep, my failure, my error, my sin can't be me. It has to be this. That's the same thing Saul did. And it perpetuates in Saul's life to the point where it continues to go. And as God calls Saul to go and kill the Amalekites and wipe them out, these people that are sinful, that hate God, he says, go wipe every single thing out. The sheep, the oxen, the goats, the herds, everything. Go take it out. And he goes, and he, of course, spares King Agag, the king that is there, and he takes the best sheep because he's thinking, what's the big deal? It's not that big of a deal. He disobeys in this regard again, and he errs. He fails. And the story is insane because it says right after that, it says Samuel goes to see him, and he finds him erecting like a statue to himself. Like he does wrong, and his first response is like, look how good I did. That's his first response. A prideful, boastful, arrogant response to doing wrong, which leads to God ripping the kingdom away from Saul. Even after that, after he hears that, Saul repents, but it's too late for him because he has proven himself to be this. I mean, there is a timeline on our pride. Your kids should have an opportunity to fail, an opportunity to live their life so that they can go into adulthood without all of your protection and hedging and all that stuff. Give them the opportunity. But then when they fail, you've got to make sure that they don't respond in pride because pride leads to destruction. If they come out and point the fingers at everybody, you got to say, no. Let's talk about what you did. Let's talk about what your part of this is. What could you have done differently? What should you have done? What was right? The other way they can respond is they can respond with humility. That will produce growth. They can either respond with a prideful, boastful arrogance that leads to their destruction, or you could point them to humility and growth. Just as a contrast to King Saul, you have the reality of King David, who is known in the city, known to us as a man after God's own heart, but we all know what David did with Bathsheba and killing her husband Uriah and how grievous of a sin this was, and he failed. I mean, he sinned against God. He disrespected another man. Breaking this massive commandment is a shame what he did, a man after God's own heart. But what's the difference between him and Saul? When he gets confronted by the prophet, when Nathan comes to him, David's response is one of contrition, one of acceptance, one of humility. We get one of the best psalms ever written out. This, cleanse my heart, O God. I'm a sinner. We have these language from David showing a level of contrition and humility. one of my favorite examples of this is just thinking about Jesus letting Peter get to the place where he can deny him 3 times in a row. I mean, there could have been stops and provisions and careful structures put around Peter that God could have ordained to make sure that Peter was faithful through the whole entire persecution period up and through the resurrection and everything was fine. But in some sense, it was beneficial for Peter to go through this experience where he was confronted with his own weakness and fear and insecurity. And as he had this moment, then he had a right response of humility. And when Jesus restores Peter, there is like this full-blown restoration and growth that takes place. Now, Peter is now elevated to this position where everything that Jesus said in his life about being this apostle who's going to really lead the church during this period is now the case. But if it wasn't for this opportunity for him to stumble through and have the right response, what would have become of Peter? I just want you to think about your kids. Whatever it is that they're doing, they get into a fight with a friend, they get in trouble at school, they have an opportunity for a misstep. Your coaching needs to push them in the direction of do not push the blame on someone else, do not elevate yourself, do not do this. You accept what you can accept. Did you do wrong? Own it and leave it there. This will be the tool that pushes your kids further and faster than you think it can. I mean, if you allow them to do this, you can really ramp them up in their growth just by giving them this opportunity and this specific coaching for humility and growth. Let me give you some practical things. Here's some practical things, okay? And then that's it. I'm gonna leave you there. Just some phrases that'll maybe help you with this. I think it's important in your home that you think of failure in some regards as normal, okay? I don't think if your kid murders someone, you should think it's normal, right? I don't think gross, grievous sin is normal. But general failure can be treated as normal. If you can create a culture in your home where they're not going to die if they have an error, this will help. It will help them to walk into these environments and learn from them, right? I think it's imperative for you to require right responses to failure. If their response is pride, stop it. Your direction as a parent is to see them not do what Eli's sons did, but to say, no, do not become prideful and arrogant and haughty in this. You need to submit yourself, force them to do it, unlike Eli, who did not do that. Then I think it's important that you force your kid to do some introspection in their own life and do some personal evaluation after their failure. What was it? Why did you do this? You messed up. It's okay. You're not dead to us. We're not cutting you off. It's not the worst thing in the world because there's some normalization of this. You seem to be responding rightly. You see your part in this. That's good. There's some humility. Now, why do you think this was the case? The growth your kid can have from a failure moment by learning through personal evaluation can be drastic. Then you should discuss that together. Let them go off on their own and then say, how do we deal with this together as a household? Well, what do you think? What do you think the reasons were? What do you think the reasons were? Let's talk about it, and let's talk about what the Bible has to say about it. Well, we know this is true and this is true. You should have done this. You didn't do this. This would be wise. You should have learned this, but you didn't. Now you know. Now you know what to do. And then not to leave it there, but to say, now let's go do it again. Let's go back after whatever we were going for and not throw the towel in and not get up and not get discouraged, but say, let's make another attempt. Let's get to the point where we can say, let's go for it. If this is a good thing that you're doing, then let's do it. If you have a failure and you messed up, say it's in a workplace or a job, or you didn't talk to your boss or something like that happened, go back and talk to your boss. Go back in. You're not quitting. You're going to keep going. And then lastly, when your kid makes progress, not perfection, celebrate the progress. Anticipate them to make progress and say, that's good, that's good. You weren't doing as good in that class, now you're doing better. You were being disrespectful to the teacher, now you're doing better. Hey, you weren't doing this thing you committed to, now you're doing it. That's good. You learned. That's exceptional. This is like the tail end of parenting. Like, you got teenagers, you got to get them to the finish line. Well, how do you get them there? Give them these opportunities. Coach them through these things. This is like the last little tool in the toolbox. Just as an example of this, I grew up in a home where shooting as a young child, shooting guns as a young child was very normal. I started shooting with my father and my uncle in the desert when I was 5 years old, believe it or not. And the amount of gun safety lessons, coaching, sitting on their laps, figuring out how to do everything was insanely extensive. I mean, just so much of that. I mean, I had to repeat the gun laws and rules to my uncle every time we went out. Every time he'd have to show me, this is how you clear a gun, this is how you do it safety, you never do this, you never do that. I'd have to repeat it like I was in the military, just over and over and over again as like a 5-year-old. And I'd do that for a few years, and then it finally got to the point where I was young enough where I started to be able to sit and shoot with my uncle and my dad under some level of supervision. They would be with me, but I'd be handling on my own, and they would correct the missteps, and they would evaluate in the process. They'd give me more leeway and more leeway. And I will never forget the day where they said, you can go off on your own. And they handed me my gun, which was a BB gun, and they gave me a BB gun. I don't remember how old I was, and I went off into the desert by myself. And they gave me a stack of plates to shoot. And I stuck the plates on some rocks way too close, and I shot them at my heart's content, thinking, this is awesome, I love this. And then a ricochet bounced back and hit me dead in between my eyes. And I was bleeding from here, and I was scared. Now, my uncle and my dad did so much coaching. I mean, they did so much coaching. It was like incessant. I was annoyed with it. I was like, when are you going to stop? Just let me go shoot. I can handle a BB gun, Dad. Like, what's the big deal? There is no lesson like the lesson of thinking I could have lost my eye with a BB gun shooting plates by myself. Given that little bit of freedom, I had an opportunity to learn from all the coaching that my parents did in such a deep way that I will never forget it. And then I remember coming back with blood on my face and having to explain what happened and saying, yep, I was standing about 4 feet from a rock shooting at it, and having to eat humble pie and deal with it, and my uncle and my dad saying, well, you learned your lesson, didn't you? I sure did. What are you going to do this time? Not do that. All right, let's go back out and let's shoot together again. Pulled the reins back in a little bit tighter, did it together until I was able to do it on my own. It's just an example of how in a small area we can extrapolate this into every aspect of our parenting to allow our kids to have this opportunity to learn. So, it is my hope that with some of these principles here and what you have in your groups, you'll be able to discuss this in such a way that will give you some insights in how you as a parent are responding to this issue and letting your kids deal with problems on their own, letting them fail, and coaching them through it. All right, let me pray, and then I'll send you off to groups. God, we know parenting is hard. We know so intuitively that you have given us the role as protectors, as defenders of our children, but you've also called us not to be control freaks, but you call us to be stewards of our kids, knowing that we have them for a time, and then they're gone. So God, I do ask that you would help us as we get to the tail end for many of us in our parenting, before our kids go off on our own, that you would maximize our kids' growth by giving us the right way of thinking about getting them across the finish line by increasing this one little step this week. God, we ask that you would help us in our discussions tonight to think and evaluate our own parenting and what we could do better in this regard to raise up kids that love you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.